Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us here at this historic event. It is my great honor to introduce our very special guest speaker tonight, the President of the Republic of China, Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou. President Ma earned his law degree from National Taiwan University in 1972, and then a Master of Laws degree from NYU, and his SJD from Harvard Law School. I notice Stanford is not in that list, but President Ma, we're delighted to have you in any case. Upon returning to Taiwan, he worked as the English interpreter and secretary to Taiwan's then president, Chiang Ching-kuo. At the age of 38, he became the youngest cabinet member in Taiwan's history. In 1998, he was elected mayor of Taipei and was re-elected in 2002. In 2005, he was elected the chairman of the Kuomintang Party. In the 2008 presidential election, Ma won a landslide victory with over 58% of the vote. This election represented Taiwan's second peaceful transfer of political power, a milestone in the country's democratic development. In 2012, he was re-elected as the 13th term president. Soon after taking office, President Ma helped steer Taiwan through the difficult global financial tsunami. In foreign policy, he has sought to deepen Taiwan's participation in regional economic integration in East Asia and to transform Taiwan into a peacemaker. President Ma has called for Taiwan and the mainland to reconcile their differences. During his presidency, the two sides have significantly expanded cross-strait cooperations, including direct flights and a rapid growth of trade and tourism across the straits. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted and honored to present to you His Excellency, the President of the Republic of China, Dr. Ma Ying-jeou.
Professor Rice, Professor Diamond, Professor Fukuyama, Admiral Roughead, distinguished guests, faculty members and students of Stanford University, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's your evening now, but it's our morning here in Taipei. Before I start, I want to pay my deep condolences to those victims suffered by the explosion that happened at Boston Marathon on Monday. My prayers and thoughts are with their family members. In the meantime, I also strongly condemn the violence on behalf of the government of the Republic of China, Taiwan. Let me start. It's a great pleasure to address my friends at Stanford University this evening. Stanford University has long been a distinguished center of learning. Under the guidance of Professor Diamond, the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, through the Journal of Democracy, has made incomparable contributions to the study of democracy. Since Taiwan represents a shining example of how democracy can take root in the Chinese-speaking world, it is only fitting to join you today for this video conference. Since I took office as President of the Republic of China in 2008, the geopolitical situation in East Asia has undergone tremendous change. 5 years ago, there were two flashpoints: the Korean Peninsula and the Taiwan Straits. Today, the Korean Peninsula is at an unprecedented level of tension. North Korea has conducted a third nuclear test explosion, and in the aftermath of the resulting UN sanctions, continues its saber rattling, even claiming that it has abrogated the 1953 Armistice Agreement that ended Korean war fighting 60 years ago. In contrast, tension in the Taiwan Strait have been greatly reduced, and relations between Taiwan and mainland China continue to advance toward peace and prosperity. This does not necessarily mean, however, that only one potential source of instability remains in East Asia. Geopolitical competition in both the East China Sea and South China Sea is growing more intense, even as the drive toward regional economic integration continues. In addition, three of the major players in East Asia, mainland China, South Korea, and Japan, have changed leadership in the last 8 months, while here in Taiwan, I was elected to a second term of office early last year. Thus, amidst the uncertainty resulting from such changes, the Republic of China on Taiwan remains firmly committed to fostering peace and stability, and is a strong proponent of the liberal values cherished by democracy worldwide. It is against this backdrop that I would like to discuss how my administration has steered Taiwan through this sea of change. I decided to seek rapprochement with mainland China long before I took office in 2008. To ensure peace in the Taiwan Strait, after some 60 tumultuous years, my administration had to meet both the challenges of establishing mutual trust between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait and of rebuilding Taiwan's strength so that peace could be guaranteed. From the start, the 92 Consensus, 92共识, was a critical anchoring point for Taiwan and mainland China to find common ground on the otherwise intractable issue of one China. The consensus reached between the two sides in 1992 established a common understanding of one China with respective interpretations, 一个中国各自表述. With this understanding as the foundation, my administration designed a number of modus operandi that broadly define how Taiwan would pursue peace and prosperity with mainland China. This included iteration of the three no's: no unification, no independence, and no use of force under the framework of the Republic of China Constitution. 在中华民国宪法架构下，维持不统、不独、不武的现状。This formulation, grounded the jury in the 1947 Constitution of the Republic of China, sets clear parameters for how both parties can work to move the relationship forward in a positive direction without misunderstandings or hidden agenda, so as to build mutual trust and achieve mutual benefit for the people on either side of the Taiwan Strait. Beating swords into plowshares requires pragmatism and wisdom to remain focused on what can be accomplished in spite of past differences. So we then call for mutual non-recognition of sovereignty, mutual non-denial of governing authority, 主权互不承认，治权互不否认, allowing both sides to pursue substantive exchanges without being derailed by disagreement over sovereignty issues. We also spell out clearly to the other side, as well as to the Taiwan public, how we intended to proceed with the cross-strait dialogue. The priority of issues for the two sides to address would be pressing matters before less pressing ones, easy matters before difficult ones, and economic matters before political ones. 先急后缓，先易后难，先精后正. My administration firmly believed in setting a clear agenda from the start to prevent the cross-strait dialogue being bogged down by intractable issues when we could see that agreement might be found on many others. The goal is to build mutual trust which is fundamental for long-term progress in developing a peaceful cross-strait relationship. I firmly believe that this building blocks approach is the only way to achieve lasting peace in the Taiwan Strait. The result of this is 18 agreements concluded between Taiwan and mainland China over the past 5 years, covering such issues as direct flights, tourism, economic cooperation, intellectual property rights, nuclear safety, and mutual judicial assistance. Let me just give you an example of how things stand now. 5 years ago, there were no scheduled flights between Taiwan and the mainland. Now there are 616 scheduled flights per week. 5 years ago, there were 274,000 mainland people visiting Taiwan. In 2012, there were 2.5 million people. When the SARS epidemic first broke out in 2003, mainland China completely ignored Taiwan's needs and concerns. But when the H7N9 avian flu struck recently, public health experts from both sides began working together to check its spread. Over the next 3 years, the two sides are expected to complete negotiations on trade in services and trade in goods under the 2010 Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, ECFA. Both sides will also greatly expand the level of educational and cultural exchanges. For example, the number of students from mainland China studying in Taiwan, which currently is 17,000 a year, is expected to rise, and there will be more cross-strait cultural cooperation. Each side also intends to set up offices in major cities on the other side to take better care of the 7 million people and over $160 billion worth of goods and services moving across Taiwan Strait last year alone. As a result, cross-strait relations are now the most stable and peaceful that they have been in over 60 years. As cross-strait relations continue to develop peacefully, Taiwan is gaining an enhanced international presence. The clear parameter articulated by my administration as we began resumption of the cross-strait dialogue counter any mistaken attempt to link Taiwan's greater international participation to an agenda of two Chinas, one China, one Taiwan, or Taiwan independence. Taiwan today strives to conduct itself as a responsible stakeholder, that is, as a facilitator of peace, a provider of humanitarian aid, a promoter of cultural exchanges, a creator of new technology and business opportunity, and a stand-up bearer of Chinese culture. The international community has seen recently how Taiwan deports itself as a responsible stakeholder and facilitator of peace. Last August, my administration proposed an East China Sea peace initiative urging that negotiation take over confrontation regarding the sovereignty dispute over the Diaoyutai Islets. The following November, Taipei and Tokyo began negotiations on an East China Sea fishery agreement. 16 rounds of such talks had been held since 1996, but no agreement was ever reached. This time, both sides decided to jointly conserve and manage fishery resources in the agreement area of the East China Sea without changing their respective territorial and maritime claims regarding the Diaoyutai Islets. A fishery agreement was thus signed 6 days ago, which safeguards the security of fishing boats from both sides in the agreement area, twice the size of Taiwan. This agreement marks a historic milestone in the development of Taiwan-Japan relations and sets a good example of how the concerned parties can find ways to settle their dispute and preserve peace and stability in the region at the same time. Our efforts over the past 5 years to enhance Taiwan's participation in the international community have also resulted in concrete progress. The Republic of China has kept intact its diplomatic relations with its 23 allies and has enhanced its substantive relations with other countries. For instance, we signed an investment agreement with Japan in 2011 and are working to sign economic cooperation agreements with Singapore and New Zealand, respectively, in the near future. Meanwhile, our health minister has attended the World Health Assembly, WHA, of the WHO as an official observer since 2009, the same year as Taiwan acceded to the Government Procurement Agreement, GPA, of the WTO. For 5 years in a row, former Vice President Lian Zhan and my request has attended as leaders representative of the leaders meeting of Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC. On March 19 this year, I led an official delegation to attend the investiture of Pope Francis, the first time for a Republic of China president to meet with the Pope in the last 71 years ever since the two countries established diplomatic ties in 1942. Taiwan's enhanced international presence attests to a virtuous cycle of improved cross-strait relations and encourage greater international support for allowing Taiwan further opportunity to play its role as responsible stakeholder. This, in turn, further enhances regional peace and stability, which is in the best interest of the international community. My administration is fully aware that strength is fundamental to achieving peace. When I took office 5 years ago, my administration worked promptly to restore high-level trust between Taipei and Washington. As former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said in 2011 in Honolulu, Hawaii, Taiwan is an important security and economic partner of the United States. We deeply appreciate the relationship we have with the United States, including U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. Only with the sufficient self-defense capability can Taiwan confidently engage in a dialogue with mainland China. The stability engendered by America's enhanced presence in the Western Pacific will certainly help. The United States is Taiwan's third largest trading partner, but remains the most important source of our technology. However large a trading partner mainland China is to Taiwan, the United States has always been an important trade and investment partner to Taiwan. The ICT, information and communication technology industries, are Taiwan's most important export sector, and they are the largest recipient of U.S. investment. We definitely want to deepen our economic ties with the United States. After successfully resolving the beef import issue last year, the Republic of China resumed trade negotiations with the U.S. under the 1994 Taiwan-U.S. Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, TIFA. Obviously, Taiwan needs to accelerate its pace of trade liberalization. For the good of its economic prosperity and national security, Taiwan cannot afford to be left out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. Culturally, American values and its high academic standards have attracted Chinese students since Yong Wing became the first Chinese student to study in the U.S. back in 1847. Generations of Chinese students who study in the United States brought American values back to their homeland, making tremendous contributions to China's modernization, including the 1911 revolution. Today, the United States still remains the most sought-after academic destination for Taiwan students. Taiwan is grateful to the United States for letting Taiwan join the visa waiver program beginning in November last year. The Republic of China is the 37th nation in the world to secure that status, and the only one that does not have formal diplomatic relations with the United States. The more than 400,000 Taiwan visitors to the U.S. each year not only take in American culture and natural scenery, and they also shop very seriously in the United States, and thus help reduce the U.S. trade deficit with Taiwan. In a word, relations between the Republic of China and the United States continue to thrive and grow since the end of formal diplomatic ties in 1979. Nevertheless, Taiwan still faces many challenges with only limited resources at its disposal. In formulating Taiwan's national security strategy, my administration has steered Taiwan towards a tripartite national security framework. The first part involves the institutionalization of the rapprochement with mainland China, so that neither side would ever contemplate resorting to non-peaceful means to settle their differences. The second part involves making Taiwan a model world citizen by upholding the principles of a liberal democracy, championing free trade and providing foreign aid to the international community. The third part involves strengthening national defense capability. This national security strategy is formulated to facilitate peaceful and positive development of cross-strait ties, while remaining grounded in the pragmatic realization of the challenges we face. In other words, Taiwan and the United States share the same values and interests in preserving regional peace and stability. States in security partnership frequently fear being entrapped or abandoned by their partners. In the past, some in the United States have expressed concern that as mainland China rises, Taiwan might someday entrap the United States in an unnecessary conflict with mainland China. Others fear that Taiwan is tilting towards mainland China, thus abandoning the United States. Both arguments seem to imply that the United States should reduce support for Taiwan, but neither view is warranted. My administration's pursuit of rapprochement with mainland China has clearly helped preserve and enhance peace in the Taiwan Strait. My administration's adherence to the Constitution of the Republic of China legally rules out any possibility of a reckless change in the status quo. Taiwan has so much in common with the United States, from our love of democracy to respect for human rights and the rule of law, to support for free trade, and even to an intense passion for basketball and baseball. We are also crazy about Jeremy Lin and Jianming Wang. Taiwan cherishes its long-standing friendship with the United States. We will always cherish the values and culture that the Chinese people have developed over 5,000 years. Preserving the Republic of China has immense importance that goes far beyond the borders of Taiwan. For the first time in Chinese history, we in Taiwan have proved that democracy can thrive in a Chinese society. It presents a shining way of hope to the 1.3 billion Chinese people on the mainland. I know how much this means to the government and people of the United States, just as it does to my administration and the people of Taiwan. Ladies and gentlemen, my administration will steer this democracy through the sea of change in East Asia. We will endeavor to strengthen peace and prosperity in the Taiwan Strait. And in the meantime, we will strive for an enhanced international presence for Taiwan that allows it to play its role as a responsible stakeholder in the international community. I feel nothing but confidence about the future of the Republic of China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Ma, for that really quite interesting and thorough discussion. I would like to perhaps open our discussion with you by asking you to talk further about the remarks that you made about U.S.-Taiwan relations. Mm-hmm. I was Secretary of State in 2008 when you were elected, and perhaps it's not understood fully that the United States was in fact very supportive of the idea of the improvement of cross-straits relations, that the United States has also a great stake in a peaceful relationship and evolution of the relationship between the mainland and Taiwan. Sometimes, however, people worry that the improvement of relations with the mainland may indeed begin to change the nature of the relationship between the United States and Taiwan. And so even though I think in Washington it is very much applauded what you have done in cross-straits relations, how would you answer those who say, as Taiwan moves closer to the mainland in its relationships, the relationship with the United States will not be the same?
Well, ever since I took office, we greatly improved our relationship with the mainland and greatly reducing the tension between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. That is certainly in the interest of the United States, because we want to make sure not only to the United States, to Japan, to other friends in this part of the world, our rapprochement with mainland China will actually benefit the international community in general, and specifically to countries in East Asia. As I pointed out in my speech, actually there were two flashpoints in Asia. Now, this one in Taiwan Strait has almost been removed. Our relation with the mainland continued to advance toward peace and prosperity, and we are trying to build up the mutual trust so that neither side will resort to non-peaceful means in settle our differences. So we are actually going in this direction as we plan it. And I'm sure this will very much in the U.S. interest, and that is why we continue to receive actually support for our policy to ease the tension across Taiwan Strait. So I'm very confident the relationship will be not only mutually beneficial to us and to mainland China, but also to the rest of the world.
Thank you, President Ma. While we collect some questions from the audience, let me turn to my fellow panelists, perhaps to Admiral Roughead first. President Ma addressed the security situation in the Asia-Pacific region, the worsening situation among a number of the players there. How do you see the situation, and perhaps you would like to engage President Ma on the security situation?
Well, thank you very much. And President Ma, it's a privilege to be here and to be able to participate in this discussion. And I recall being in Taiwan last summer talking about your recent East China Sea Peace Initiative. And it's clear to me that no one that I know has studied, researched, and written on the situation, particularly in the East China Sea, as much as you have. But I think as you describe the security situation, clearly the events of today, the unhelpful actions that are being taken by North Korea are dominating the security discussions and decisions in the region. But prior to that, it's clear that the maritime issues in the East China Sea, South China Sea, tended to dominate and occupy the attention of so many countries. Your East China Sea peace initiative that I think was very thoughtful, very far-reaching, and very structured, has been helpful. And then, as I see it, with the agreement that has just been reached with Japan, it begins to move down the steps that you described in the peace initiative, which is dialogue, sharing of resources, then leading on to code of conduct, and then joint research exploration. You've moved down 2 steps in the case of the East China Sea. Where do you see the situation going, and how do you see the environment for those further steps in your peace initiative?
Yes, I proposed the East China Sea Peace Initiative last August. I understand the difficulties of reaching consensus. That is why I divided the process into 2 phases. Phase 1 will involve 3 sets of bilateral talks. Bilateral talks between Japan and mainland China, Taiwan, and Taiwan and Japan. Because it will be very difficult to begin with a tripartite negotiations. So we divide that in 2 phases. And the second phase will be 1 set, but trilateral negotiation. So we try to start the negotiation with Japan. Well, to put it in a more precise way, to resume talks with Japan after 16 rounds of failed negotiations. But this time, we made it. Both sides recognize the need to have agreement to reduce the tension and escalation. And the agreement we signed 6 days ago actually demonstrates how we can really handle a crisis situation to reach agreement without sacrificing each other's territorial and maritime claims. In other words, I always believe that while national sovereignty cannot be divided, but natural resources can be shared. If we focus first on natural resources, joint development, and joint conservation and management, I think we can develop the kind of mutual trust that may eventually lead us to the solution of sovereignty issues. Obviously, our idea, as far as our relations with Japan are concerned, worked. We hope we could also expand that to the other 2 sets of claimants in the area. Actually, Japan already concluded a fishery agreement, an agreement on resource development with mainland China in East China Sea, and we also have certain cooperation with mainland China on joint effort for sea rescue and the oil development in the Taiwan Strait between our Chinese Petroleum Corporation and its counterpart on the mainland. So we do have some basis for bilateral negotiation. We can go from there. And I think this is probably the only way to reduce tension in East China Sea. As you can see, we pay a lot of attention to being the role of a peace facilitator. We reduce tension between mainland China and Taiwan, and we also try to reduce tension between Taiwan and Japan regarding the fishery issues. And the fishery agreement is very much welcomed by our fishermen and also accepted by the Japanese side. We understand we still have a long way to go, but at least we made a very good beginning.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you. And Frank, maybe I can involve you here. President Ma is describing a really very practical approach to a regional look at Asia and Taiwan's role in trying to think of Asia as a region. One of the things that we often discuss, however, is the lack of institutions in Asia. Perhaps you would like to comment on that, and to President Ma as well.
Yes, well, thank you, President Ma. It's a really great honor to see you again, to welcome you to Stanford, if only virtually. Yes, so I want to follow on, and this follows on, I think, naturally from Admiral Roughead's question. which has to do with the longer-term structure of Asia, the institutional structure, and what your vision for that is, and Taiwan's role in this. So actually, Asia is an alphabet soup of different weak institutions. So you've got APEC, you've got ASEAN, you've got ASEAN +3, you've got the TPP. So there's no end, actually, of multilateral organizations. And even the form of organization has become a form of competition. So, for example, ASEAN +3 includes ASEAN, Japan, Korea, and China, but it excludes the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Similarly, the TPP, if we look down the road, who's going to qualify for that? I'm sure Taiwan could qualify, Japan could qualify, most of the democracies could. One country that's not likely to qualify anytime soon is China. And so obviously there are very competing divisions, and in fact, in terms of the South China Sea, the Chinese have said to the individual members of ASEAN that we don't want you to even talk about these issues multilaterally. We just want to do this on a bilateral basis. So I'm wondering if you could just talk about whether there is an appropriate institutional form coming out of your East China Sea initiative, looking down the road, that would be right for dealing with some of these really dangerous flashpoints. And then in particular, what is Taiwan's, where does that provide an entry place for Taiwan to be, a more secure and respected member of that community?
Well, East China Sea and South China Sea are both flashpoints. But pretty much like what I said about Korean Peninsula and Taiwan Strait, we try to do one thing at a time. We first removed the flashpoint in Taiwan Strait, and suddenly Taiwan can hardly play a big role in the issue of the Korean Peninsula. But in East China Sea, we are also a player, and we can also play a constructive role. And this is exactly the reason why I proposed the East China Sea initiative. I studied all these issues for over 40 years. I understand actually the core of the issue is resources, not the island itself. So we may attack the resources issue first, and hoping to build some mutual trust, some consensus before we can move to the settlement of the territorial dispute. So I think our first move to conclude a fishery agreement with Japan just demonstrate how this can be done gradually. I understand it's very difficult to get the three sides together to discuss issues of common concern, but it has to be done. There's no other solution. And I get the inspiration from a very good president in the North Sea in Europe. There were quite a few claimants disputing the territorial and maritime issues because of the resources. But once 3 of the countries went to International Court of Justice and have a decision in the continental shelf, later they decided to reach agreement and find out cooperation is much better than confrontation. So today, the countries together actually created a very famous brand in the international oil market, the brand crude. And this is a very good precedent that other countries can learn. If the North Sea coastal countries can do that, why couldn't the coastal countries of East China Sea? And we want to make the first step just to show that peace could be reached if we are serious. And on the South China Sea, as a result of more claimants, the situation is much more complex and may take more time. But as far as East China Sea is concerned, I am cautiously optimistic that we could move from here to other issues, not just resources, but also a joint effort for rescue at sea environmental protection or joint marine scientific research. There are a lot of issues that affect the East China Sea, which could be discussed and reach agreement by countries in the region. So, in other words, the very basic idea is that international dispute should be settled peacefully. And if there's no immediate solution, we could reach some consensus on the provisional measures, which is actually called for by the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. Provisional measures in order to solve a very complex and intractable territorial dispute.
Thank you very much. Let me remind everyone that we are being simulcast to a number of other locations, and some of those people will be tweeting in. And while we're collecting questions from the audience, and I promise you we're going to get to those questions quite quickly, I would like to turn for a moment to the question of Taiwan as a beacon for democracy, particularly a beacon for 1.3 billion people across the straits. And perhaps, Larry, to have you take up that question while I look at questions that we've already received.
Yes, if you could ask Rob to bring those questions in. President Ma, it's a great honor to have you here and to see you again. Thank you so much for honoring Stanford with this opportunity. Professor Rice has mentioned a couple of issues, and one of them that are relevant to the democracy question. So let me reiterate the first question she asked and add a second question to it. Many scholars are suggesting now that with so many people from the mainland, as you indicated, over 2 million visiting Taiwan, and not a few of them visited Taiwan during your presidential election campaign and saw what it was like for a country to have a free and open political campaign. And many of them, you know, across the strait are watching Taiwan television and, for better or for worse, watching the battering you sometimes get, as any president does in a free society, on television. So what impact do you think this is happening on China, and how do you see, on mainland China, and how do you see the possible influence of Taiwan's increasingly consolidated and liberal democracy on the political evolution of the mainland? And then the second part of the question would be, what are the implications of Taiwan being a democracy and East Asia moving increasingly in a democratic direction for peace? There is a democratic peace thesis that a region of democracies will be a zone of peace, but there are also those who argue that the movement to democracy in the mainland could be destabilizing, that any kind of political instability could be destabilizing and might stimulate nationalist sentiment. So what are your views on this?
Obviously, what happened in Taiwan, particularly in regard to democratic development, will have an impact on mainland China. You pointed out that there are increasing number of mainland people coming to Taiwan just to watch our campaign, our election process. And, well, I'm sure they went back with a very different understanding of what is going on. What I think for mainland China, of course, they encounter many problems we had 30 years ago. But this time is very different now, particularly after the advent of the internet. So they can actually, actually see all the campaign processes through the internet. I was very much surprised that this time there was no restriction on their access to information of this sort. And there are people who came specifically to Taiwan to watch the election process. So I'm sure the impact will be felt in the future, certainly. On the other hand, our effort to make peace across Taiwan Strait is also very much appreciated, not only by the two sides of Taiwan Strait, but by our neighbors. And I think this all contribute to a much friendly international environment for Taiwan and also to the stability in East Asia. I don't foresee a very sudden change of Mainland's political system toward democracy, but obviously they will pay more attention to the human rights issue, to the treatment of dissidents. As you know, every year in the anniversary of June 4th, I will make a statement calling upon Mainland's side to follow the principles of human rights and other things. I did it not on the basis of a Western value, but on the typical traditional Chinese value to respect different opinions. This is also a part of the great Chinese tradition. And I think by doing that, we try to bring the two sides together in dialogues on democracy, rule of law, human rights, and freedom. And I think many people in Taiwan also consider that become a very important part of our relations with the mainland. Not just trade, not just investment, not just protection of intellectual property rights, but also the right to express their opinions. And I think the impact will be felt. And I'm sure the process is very constructive and useful for the two sides to build some kind of consensus in the future about how the two different societies could interact with each other. And particularly when now in mainland China, there emerges quite a few NGOs, which was not existing in the past. And these NGOs and their counterparts in Taiwan could also have interaction that would further stimulate the emergence of the civil society on mainland China. And this is, as you're expert in this area understand, is very important for the growth of democracy. So I think it's, for us, it is a very positive development that the two sides will not only have trade investment, but other very important issues concerning the development of democracy and human rights.
Following up on that, there are a couple of questions here about democracy in Taiwan, but if I may just follow on with a question to Larry's comment, there must also be, between the younger generations now in Taiwan and on the mainland, more contact. And how do you see that playing out over the years? University students, young business people, and the like, because you gave a quite startling statistic about how many visitors there are between the mainland and Taiwan. So can you talk about the people-to-people aspect of the relationship?
As I pointed out in my speech, the number of visitors that came to Taiwan last year is over 2.5 million. And of course, most of them are tourists or business people, but they were 17,000 students as well. Around less than 2,000 were registered full-time students. The rest are exchange students. Exchange students stay maybe half a year or a year. But because of the numbers growing and the impact is also being felt, if they stay here in Taiwan for 6 months, they will make use of every minute to travel, to meet people, and understand Taiwan. And that process actually changed them a lot. You know, after 60 years of separation between China and mainland China and Taiwan, there are a lot of misunderstandings. And one Taiwanese student told me when they visited mainland, a lady asked him, "Do you speak Portuguese in Taiwan?" No, it's, they probably read about the Portuguese sailors while they are sailing back around Taiwan. They call Ilha Formosa, with beautiful island in Portuguese. So they had a wrong impression. That kind of, Taiwan also had misunderstandings on mainland China. So the kind of change, which massive exchange started 5 years ago, obviously will greatly reduce the kind of misunderstanding. And this is a very important step toward peaceful development. If the young people from the two societies can understand each other at a rather early stage of their life, I'm sure there is possibility that they could build a lifelong friendship. And as more students come from mainland China, I think we will be in a better position to do that. That is why I call for even more liberalization on the current restriction on the exchange of students. And we used to recognize only 41 universities of mainland of their diplomas. This year, we increase from 41 universities to 111, so that more students will come to Taiwan. And at the same time, more students from Taiwan will go to mainland China. And we also encourage our people, well, even have home stays for mainland students, so that they will understand each other much better. I think this interchange or between young people will have the best results. I'm sure your country has also done that before. Countries like France and Germany have a massive student exchange program right after World War II that forged a lasting friendship between the two countries, and after centuries of feud between the two sides. So this is something we should learn from history. We should learn from other countries. I'm sure all the people across Taiwan Strait will have the kind of wisdom to do this. And I certainly will be very happy to continue to do that and making that possible for the young people from two sides of Taiwan Strait.
Thank you. From our audience, we have another question about democracy. But if I could, there are a couple of questions. Essentially, people are saying, but democracy is, by its very nature, people have very different views within democracies, and they are allowed to express them. And so the question is, since democracy brings very different views, how do you reconcile people's views within Taiwan who may have a different international vision for Taiwan? Issues like national defense or even cross-straits relations. Are those voices being heard in Taiwan? Do you think there's a consensus behind the idea of the cross-straits rapprochement?
Yes, this is a very good question. When we started to open up to mainland China and improve relations with them, obviously there are different opinions. So the Mainland Affairs Council, which is the agency in charge of our relations with the mainland, frequently conduct opinion polls asking the same set of questions. One of those is, do you think our pace of interchange with mainland is too fast, too slow, or just about right? And in the last 20 years, the figure demonstrates that the most people will choose just about right. But sometimes there are people who believe it's too fast, and sometimes people believe it's too slow. But the majority would think it's just about right, and about more than 40%. On the other hand, we also ask questions about the future of Taiwan. One is reunification with the mainland, the other is independence, and the third one is maintaining the status quo. But if you count very precisely, almost more than 70% supports maintaining the status quo. That is why in my speech I pointed out that maintaining no unification, no independence, and no use of force in the Taiwan Strait under the framework of the Constitution of the Republic of China is probably the common denominator of the mainstream opinion in Taiwan. And this has been like this for more than 20 years. So I think it's probably could be considered a so-called Taiwan consensus. And so that is why we considered maintaining the status quo is the most important foundation of our policy toward the mainland. And that's one area. For other things, for instance, as I pointed out in my speech, we are negotiating with the mainland to set up offices in each other's place. And this issue is being debated in our legislative yuan, 立法院, on whether this office will have functions to issue documents or to provide the kind of services like a foreign consulate. We point out very clearly, the relationship between Taiwan and mainland China are not state-to-state relations. It's a special relations which is regulated in our side by our constitution and specific laws. And we want to make sure that, as I said, no any misunderstanding about two Chinas, one China, one Taiwan, or Taiwan independence. And that is very important for cross-strait peace. So setting up offices is just intended to perform functions of taking care of the people and of the business instead of, trying to do that from a distance. As I said, the cross-strait movement of people has reached more than 7 million. And goods and services, $160 billion. But there's no office representing Taiwan on the mainland, no office representing mainland on Taiwan. This is not usual. And we have to gradually make it possible for each side to do that. Yes, people might ask whether that constitutes some analogy to international relations whatsoever. But we make it very clear that on the issue of sovereignty, we do not recognize each other. But on the issue of governing authority, we should not deny each other having such an authority. Otherwise, we cannot engage with each other. So this is a very delicate situation, very delicate issue. But since we have handled that well in the last 5 years, there's no reason to say that we couldn't do it in the future.
Thank you. Mr. President, we will unfortunately shortly run out of time, but I would like to ask at least two more questions from our audience. One is concerning the economy in Taiwan. You came into power at a very difficult time for the global economy. How do you see the development of Taiwan's economy and of Taiwan's economy within the regional context of Asia?
We did encounter difficulties in the last couple of years, first by the financial tsunami and then by the European debt. Actually, 70% of our GDP growth depends on export. Very different from other countries, even Japan and Korea. So we have to maintain the momentum of our export in order to make sure that our economy will grow. Last year, our growth is only 1.26%. It's very low. But this year will be better because the situation in Europe and the United States are slightly better than they were last year. And we also try to transform our industrial structure. In the past, we focus on the efficiency of our companies. So it's actually an efficiency-driven economy. But we want to shift that to an innovation-driven economy so that we have our own brand name and we can really get a high end of the industrial ladder. And this is a painful process because we have to give up something in order to gain something. That's one area about industrial structural change. Another one is we have been left out of regional economic integration for so long. Not until 3 years ago when we signed the first economic cooperation framework agreement with mainland China, which is similar to a FTA. But that covers only about 20% of the goods and services. So we are negotiating on the rest of ECFA. We will probably wrap up with the trade in services in a couple of months. And by the end of the year, we will complete the whole process of negotiating on trade in goods. But you see, that is the only major trading partner we have a similar agreement. Japan doesn't have one with us. We only have an investment agreement. The United States doesn't have one with us. We also want to have one with the U.S. and hopefully we'll be able to join the TPP in the future. On the other hand, we started to negotiate the economic cooperation agreement with other countries in the region. Singapore first, New Zealand the second, and we are trying out with others. We have been left behind, very much behind, our trading partners in the region. So we have to catch up and catch up fast. So this is the difficulty we encounter. But I have very strong confidence in the business of Taiwan. Our competitiveness, according to the International Institute for Management Development in Lausanne, Switzerland, in our business, almost #1 in Asia. So we still have the cutting edge, but we had really to work hard to be more liberal in terms of our trade liberalization policy so that Taiwan can be made a free trade island. And this is probably the only way for our survival and for our development. So you're right, we encounter difficulties, but we are making a lot of efforts to change that.
Thank you. Mr. President, perhaps as a last point, one of our audience members has said that you are justly proud, Taiwan is justly proud of what you have done to improve cross-strait relations, to overcome hostilities. Asia is a region that is known to have many hostile relationships, and our questioner says, is there anything from the Taiwanese approach that can be exported and replicated in the very troubled region that is Asia? So perhaps you could make a few remarks in that regard as a last point.
Well, this is certainly a very difficult question to answer. Everywhere in the world there are conflicts. But if you want to really have peace, and you really have to have the wisdom to understand the continuation of conflict will lead to even more sufferings of the people. So you have to compare the present and the future and make a right choice. For instance, our difference with Japan over the territorial issue of Diaoyutai has started for over 40 years. I, as a university student, participated in the defending Diaoyutai movement more than 40 years ago. So I understand, but the issue has to be settled. So I look at the issue, I study the issue, and I divide the issue. Sovereignty and resources, which one should come first? So what we are doing now is to shelve the issue of sovereignty disputes and proceed with resources development, joint development, trying to build mutual confidence, trying to build friendship in the process. Of course, we didn't make it in the last 40 years, but we did 6 days ago. Why? Because the situation has changed. People, after the escalation of tension, after the confrontation affecting everybody, understand that probably maintaining peace and using peaceful means to settle differences is the best way. And although the result may not please everybody, but at least we actually keep our territorial claim intact. On the other hand, we made some advances in the fishery issue. Now, our fishermen could fish freely without interference from Japanese coast guards, and then vice versa. And this is an improvement. This is a progress. And we can go from here. So first, resources. And maybe we could move from living resources to non-living resources and to other issues. So a trip of 1,000 miles started with the first step. 千里之行始于足下. This is an old Chinese saying. As long as you are determined to be a facilitator of peace, if there's a will, there's a way.
Thank you, Mr. President. And on that note, may I thank you on behalf of all of the audiences that have been watching this simulcast, but especially on behalf of Stanford University. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Dear friends and colleagues, thank you.
Oh, and Ma will make closing remarks.
Yeah, that's okay. Mr. President, it is my understanding that you will make a few closing remarks, and then Larry, you will wrap up our session. Thank you.
Well, dear friends and colleagues, since 2008, there have been peace and prosperity in the Taiwan Strait. We have seen more trade, investment, and movement of people, information across the Taiwan Straits. We have seen an increasing number of many tourists, students, and professionals come to Taiwan by direct flights. And we certainly hope that they can bring home some new understandings, new appreciations, new perspectives, what we have achieved here. On the other hand, it's also good for Taiwan people traveling to the mainland to understand more about their development. There is some cooperation, indeed, a lot more, in the fields of education, culture, sports, criminal justice, and public health. We would like to see that all of this to have some positive impact on the peace and prosperity in the Straits. Harking back to events that happened in the past 2 decades in Taiwan Strait and in the triangular relationship among Taipei, Washington, and Beijing, we may say that we finally find an equilibrium point where every party involved can be in a winning situation. This equilibrium point was possible because all parties recognized that negotiations serve as a much more efficient way than confrontation to bridge the gaps between and among them. Yet, by no means, this equilibrium point is a certainty. We have to nurture it by being perceptive to others' vital interests, by sending the right signals, by being careful with the political rhetoric and gesture we make, and most importantly, by being credible. Still, this is not enough. Taiwan has to meet a number of challenges on the domestic front to stay apace with the dynamic equilibrium in the Straits and in East Asia. These challenges are daunting, but not insurmountable. Distinguished faculty members, ladies and gentlemen, as President of the Republic of China, I will continue to steer Taiwan toward peace and prosperity. Our work is not done. Thank you very much.
Once more, finally, from Stanford University, President Ma, thank you so much for engaging us, and we look forward to the opportunity to do it again in the future, virtually or directly.
Thank you. Although this is still a morning in Taiwan, I have to say to you, good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very good.
And to all of you in the audience, many of whom I recognize are from Taiwan, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry the time didn't allow us to engage in direct conversation, but I want to thank Professor Rice for getting to so many questions from the audience and for her very able chairing of this session, and to my colleagues Frank Fukuyama and Admiral Gary Roughead. Thank you all. Thank you.